Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, and to the fourth instalment in our Memory and Learning series. So far, we've covered the basics of memory with Peps McRae back in episode 149, a really helpful primer on how it all works and what really goes on in sort of fundamentals of memory and learning. We explored John Dunlosky's Student Toolbox in action with Amarbig Singh Gill, exploring in particular some of the lesser-known strategies from that toolbox. And then we met the man himself, Professor John Dunlosky, who's been one of the most influential academics working in the field of effective study strategies, for some fantastic tips on studying smarter in practice, and some of the things that he sees from his own students proving difficult when it comes to applying the science of studying smarter and how to overcome those challenges. It's been a great series so far. Thank you to all my guests who've been here so far. We've been talking a lot about spaced retrieval practice in this series and on the podcast generally over the years, as it's a really, really powerful principle to know about if we want to get information to stick in memory. Today, I want to introduce you to another really, really powerful principle. I'd go so far as to say it's almost as powerful and important to know about as spaced retrieval practice, but it explains different aspects of how the brain thinks and learns. And that principle is cognitive load theory. There are really just so many helpful practical implications that flood out from cognitive load theory once we understand it, from productivity and time management, focus, concentration, through to how you solve difficult problems, maths problems, structure arguments in difficult essay situations, even how you address challenging interview questions, through to exam hall technique and how you engage with exam questions, which has long been a passion of mine, as readers of my very first book all those years ago, Outsmart Your Exams, will know. So, to help us today understand the power of cognitive load theory, I am delighted to welcome the author of the book Sweller's Cognitive Load Theory in Action, Mr. Ollie Lovell, who's one of the go-to authorities for translating the cognitive load theory research and explaining, well, what it means for us all in action. It's a fascinating conversation coming up. I took a lot away from it. I hope you will too. Let's meet Ollie and dive right in.
Yeah, I'm Ollie Lovell. I guess there's a few strings to the bow. I am a teacher. I work in teacher training a fair bit. I'm the author of now 3 books. They're all, just as of a couple of days ago, they're all now Amazon bestsellers as well, which is great. I host a podcast as well called the Education Research Reading Room. My main job at the moment is I'm the director of Step Lab Australia, which is an organisation focused on helping schools to improve their teaching through instructional coaching. I'm doing my PhD in self-regulated learning, which is very related to the work that you do with supporting people to be more effective students. I guess my real focus is clarifying, codifying, and communicating. And so that's across a whole host of areas, and it's the reason why I've written 3 books. But basically, I really like clarifying what are the key points of a certain area or theory that are important for people, codifying that into hopefully a bit of a kind of memorable format, and then hopefully communicating it in a clear way as well. And on top of that, I guess it's worth saying I am also a passionate student. So I've had a number of kind of learning projects over my life, one of which was trying to learn Mandarin Chinese in a year, which I was, relatively successful at, and I was able to go to China at the end of the year and did pretty well at uni and in school and things like that because I have been really focused on effective study right throughout. So I thought that was worth mentioning at the start of this podcast too.
You're among friends here.
Indeed.
I just thought it might be worth just recapping relatively briefly a little bit on how the brain works, a kind of basic cognitive architecture. Very brief refresher. Perhaps that will be a good place to start as a sort of a foundation for everything we're going to be digging into today.
Human cognitive architecture is a complex system, but we often talk about it in a simplified way. And that's because a simplified understanding of it helps us to have kind of an actionable understanding of it as well. So we often talk about human cognitive architecture as consisting of kind of 3 main parts. There's the environment. The environment is external to us, and it's where everything is. It's where this podcast is. It's where Google is. It's where books and presentations are. It's where your online course is, William. anything that people might want to learn from is in the environment. When a student or a person pays attention to something in their environment, that attention can bring that information into their working memory. And your working memory is like the site of your consciousness. It's where you think, it's where you rehearse what you're about to say next, it's where you process information. And crucially, working memory is limited. So depending upon whose research you look at, people say you can hold about 4 elements or 7 plus or minus 2 elements. The exact number is less important. What is important is it is very fragile and there's only a certain number of things you can hold at one time. I kind of think of the working memory as like a juggler. And every person's juggler has a different capacity of how many balls they can juggle. But, you can only juggle a certain number. And if you kind of try to juggle an extra one or an extra 2, things are going to kind of break down. So when you think about things in your working memory, when you can connect them to things you already know, when you do generative learning activities with them, which I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast before, and also when you sleep on it, that information can make its way up into our long-term memory. And that's kind of where we think of it as being learnt when it has made its way up there. And long-term memory is, as far as we know, unlimited. We've never heard of anyone kind of passing away from a memory that is too full, even though we do use the phrase like my memory is too full, or we don't know of anyone who's practically filled up their memory. So as far as we know, that's unlimited. And we generally talk about learning as a change in that long-term memory. And then information can be forgotten. It can be forgotten from working memory, or it can be forgotten from long-term memory. And crucially, I know something that you talk about a lot in this podcast is the idea of retrieval. Retrieval is the act of bringing information from your long-term memory back into your working memory for processing or to do things with that information. And further, crucially, that act of retrieval, bringing information from long-term into working memory, actually strengthens the storage of that information in long-term memory as well. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the human cognitive architecture.
I guess that piece about the retrieval and strengthening long-term memory, I sometimes refer to that as the challenge of making it stick, getting something to stick so you can keep it in there for longer. That's a famous book by the same name, of course. And then the working memory system and getting information in there and kind of understanding it, getting your head around it. I sometimes refer to that as the challenge of making it click. So building that initial understanding, getting your head around things, perhaps later using what you've already learned to solve problems and do things with it. And that's, I think, where we'll be spending a bit of time today. So I wanted to ask you about cognitive load theory and implications for listeners. What is cognitive load theory? What are the sort of the basics that we should know about the theory?
Sure. I like to summarize cognitive load theory with like one pithy sentence, and that is that cognitive load theory is a collection of instructional recommendations based upon the science of how humans learn. So there's kind of 2 parts to that definition. The first part is the collection of instructional recommendations. And when we say instructional recommendations, we mean like practical things that instructors should do or that students should take into consideration when information is being communicated, such that we can do so more effectively. And the science of how humans learn is basically what we just talked about. So we've already covered that kind of science part, at least very briefly. And the instructional recommendations are the more practical part. Before we started talking today, William, you said that it's great when these podcasts bring together theory and practicality. And I feel like cognitive load theory does that perfectly because it's got that theory, the science of how humans learn, and the practicality. And so for teachers, it helps teachers to understand, or instructors to know how to communicate in ways that are going to reduce the amount of what we call extraneous load, but in simple terms, the kind of distractions that they present to students, and improve the clarity. And what that means is that students are spending less working memory resources dealing with those distractions, and they can focus more on the core content to be learned. And for students, it kind of just helps them understand why something might be confusing when, in fact, the core content isn't that hard, but they're getting kind of distracted by surface features or the way the information is structured and things like that. Depending upon how far back you go in the cognitive load theory literature, there are either 1 or 2 types of load. Germane load is also mentioned a bit further back, but in more recent times, that is not being referred to as frequently. So I think it's safe to talk about 2 types of load, and that gives people the general understanding. The main load that we want to be filling up our working memory with is called intrinsic load. And intrinsic load is basically just the content that is required to be understood to grasp the concept that we're trying to learn. So when you're thinking about the core content to be learned, you're filling up your working memory with intrinsic load. Extraneous load is anything that kind of gets in the way of that. Now, that could be something in the environment. It could be if you're listening to music that has like distracting lyrics in it or something like that. It could be sirens going past. It could be your young child screaming in the room next door. It could be anything like that. So that's extraneous load.
Your phone's just gone ping, maybe.
Exactly. Anything like that. That's a really good example. Another source of extraneous load is something that the teacher does. So the teacher might add in an interesting story, but it's actually a distraction from the core content. Or they might, an example we might get to a bit later on is they might present the information, an image, at a great distance from the text that relates to that image. So you kind of have to try to integrate that information. That's called the split attention effect. So that's a source of extraneous load as well. And then, of course, there's also another source of extraneous load, and that's internally. You can just kind of daydream. You can kind of get distracted. You can start having thoughts about X, Y, or Z that's not related to the core learning content, and that can be a source of extraneous load as well. And so what we're trying to do as students as instructors as well, we're trying to minimize, ideally eliminate, but it's not really practical to eliminate, but we're trying to minimize extraneous load, minimize those distractions, which makes more space in our limited working memory to fill up our working memory with intrinsic load. And I also talk about optimizing intrinsic load, which is particularly relevant for instructors. And that means basically not introducing too many concepts at any one time, because that's going to, even if you have kind of minimized or even eliminated extraneous load, you can still overwhelm students by introducing too much intrinsic load, but also not introducing too little, because then your students are going to get bored and they're going to start to search for extraneous load to kind of keep them entertained.
This has been an incredibly influential idea in education over the past decade or two. There's that famous quote from the sort of well-known educator Dylan William. It's sort of the single most important thing for educators to know about. Or I'm paraphrasing slightly. And I know it's been a real passion area for you as well, Ollie. Like, maybe you just talk to why you feel it's such an important thing to be thinking about and teaching and to understand.
Well, I'll answer that from my perspective, and I'll also answer it from Dylan Williams' perspective as well, because he and I have talked about this at length. One of the things it's important to understand when we're thinking about intrinsic load and how quickly you can learn, essentially, is that intrinsic load comes from a thing called element interactivity. And element interactivity is basically the number of elements of new information that you're trying to juggle in your working memory at any one time, as well as the number of interactions between those elements. Okay. And the crucial thing that I said there is the number of new elements of information in working memory. And so when we say you can only hold so many things in working memory at any one time, we actually mean you can only hold so many new things in working memory at any one time. And in fact, if you're drawing on information from your long-term memory, that is not actually taking up space in your working memory in the same way as something that's new. So what that means is that it's actually crucial for us to store as much information in long-term memory as possible, because when we do that, that enables us to learn more and more. It's kind of like knowledge is kind of like money. The more you have of it, the easier it is to get more of it, right? It's compounding. And so if a student's sitting in a class and they know heaps of information about the content that's being taught, they can easily sit back and relax and let a lot of the lecture wash over them, and then really kind of focus in and home in on the key points that the lecturer is making that will take them to a higher level of understanding. Contrast that with another student who's like basically hasn't done the readings before class, doesn't know what's going on. They might be introduced to all of the content in that lecture, and they're very, very quickly going to get completely overwhelmed. So for me personally, this was like learning about cognitive load theory was absolutely revelationary, because before that, I didn't actually see the importance of knowledge. I didn't see the importance of memorizing things. I thought, we've got Google. Why do I have to memorize dates, times, historical figures, characters, whatever it might be, formulas? I've got Google, I've got formula sheets, blah, blah, blah. But actually, cognitive load theory taught me, well, you do have Google, but because your working memory is limited, and because putting stuff in your long-term memory is the only way that you can free up space in your working memory for higher and higher cognitive activities, you actually do need to memorize stuff. And so that was a revelation for me, because following that, I actually just started memorizing stuff. I started using Anki on a daily basis, and I've used it for about a decade now, every single day. And that enabled me to learn more, learn faster, and increase my knowledge a lot more quickly. So that's why, for me, CLT is really important. For Dylan William, he believes that cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know, and extremely important for students to know as well, because cognitive load theory tells us that a student can complete an activity successfully, but they can actually at the same time not learn anything from it. And so the most classic experiment that demonstrates this is one of the first cognitive load theory experiments. Basically, students were asked to do one of two things. They started with an initial number, and they call it 3, and they had to end with a final target number, call it 164. This probably isn't going to work, but that's just two random numbers, and there were a number of these problems. And the students could only do two things to try to get from the starting number to the target number. They could only multiply by 3, the present number, or subtract 29 from the present number. And so they had to try to, they might multiply by 3 times and subtract 29, multiply by 3 once, subtract 29 twice, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But they had to try it out to try to get from the starting to the target number. Now, it turned out that the solution to every one of these problems was actually just to alternate between multiply by 3 and subtract by 29, right? That was the solution to every one of the problems. But many of the students were able to solve the problems, but then when the experimenter asked them at the end, okay, you just did 5 problems using either multiply by 3 or subtract 29, did you learn anything about how to solve these problems in general? Very few of the students were able to actually say, oh, yeah, actually, I realized that you just have to alternate. So the question is, well, that seems pretty obvious. Like, why didn't they notice that? And the answer is because their working memories were so full, completing the task, they didn't have enough working memory capacity available or left for what we would call schema construction, which basically means building new memory, right? So that's an example of when intrinsic load is so high that learning actually doesn't happen. And so that's why Dylan William thinks that's really important. That's really important for teachers because often we use student success at an activity as a proxy for learning, but actually that's not the most reliable. Well, it's a proxy for learning, but it's not necessarily a reliable one. And so we can't let ourselves be fooled by thinking, oh, just because I did that, from a student perspective, oh, I did this task, and therefore I've learned from this, I know how to do it. You have to pause, step back and go, actually, what have I concretely learned from this, not just have I finished the task?
So interesting. I've been on a bit of a journey over the past couple of years with sort of working memory and cognitive load theory, and I've always considered myself a reasonably sort of intelligent, bright kind of guy, but I never scored well on working memory tests, the classic sort of tests of working memory. I'd always be on the low end of average. And that didn't square with what other things I knew about me. And, academically, I'd done really, really well. And I've kind of come to realize that is probably, like, it's true. It's true about my working memory being quite limited. But what I have been quite good at doing as a result of that is finding strategies to overcome the limitations of my working memory. So, I think a lot of the things I teach and have kind of figured out over the years just to sort of scratch my own itch to be able to figure out academic success, despite having limited working memory. A lot of those sort of strategies, particularly, my sort of things I teach for sort of strategies for the exam hall are particularly good examples of those, I think. And they've been to sort of scratch my own itch and kind of get around my own limitations of working memory. But, even if your working memory isn't limited, if you can apply those same strategies, then that only unlocks your ability to, maybe solve even more challenging problems that you might not have been able to solve otherwise.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So, and if someone's out there listening and they do have limited work, they feel like they have limited working memory, it may well be true. The most important thing they can do is make sure they're actually memorizing information, because if information is chunked and automated, this is how you refer to it, chunked as in stored in effective chunks and structured in an effective way, and automated can be accessed automatically without thinking consciously about it, then that's going to free up lots of space in their working memory. I'm actually the opposite to you, William. I haven't actually done working memory tests, but I'm pretty sure I have a pretty good working memory. I think it was probably above average, but my long-term retention is horrendous. I have worked with people for over a year, and it might give it a 3-year break, and I just cannot remember their name for the life of me. Or I might learn some facts or theories. Sometimes I can't tell you the things that I've written in my books, even though I've spent months revising them and thinking about it, rewriting. And so that's why I'm so focused on using Anki, because I know without structure, I just forget things. And so that's the kind of step I've put in place to try to account for my weakness, which I think is more long-term memory.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting. So you kind of touched on this idea a moment ago of when we kind of overload, like we've sort of been touching on this idea that when we overload working memory or we try to fit too much in it, we kind of lose our ability to make progress in whatever we're trying to read or understand or the problem we're trying to solve. Maybe just sort of talk to that in a little bit more detail. What do we mean by this idea of sort of cognitive overload?
Yeah, so I mean, it comes back to that idea I mentioned before about element interactivity. Basically, depending upon our working memory capacity, we can handle a certain number of elements of new, emphasis on new information at any one time, plus the number of interactions between those elements or the relationships between them. And basically, if we try to handle too much new info at any one time without kind of pausing and making connections and drawing conclusions and things like that, we're basically just going to find ourselves feeling, as you said, confused and going, oh, I'm a little bit lost now, is kind of often a good way to put it. So basically, if we feel like that, we just need to kind of step back and think, what's my objective here? What am I actually trying to achieve? Trace back and think, okay, this is where I started. This is the first thing I thought about. This is the second thing I thought about. And then I got confused around here, and just try to kind of work back. A really helpful thing in relation to this is just getting things out of your head and onto paper. When I was doing my master's thesis, I would find that I would be like reading one paper and I'd follow one link and I'd follow another link. And before I knew it, I was a bit lost, to be honest. I was like, how did I get here? Why am I here? And I honestly can't remember. And I developed the system. I'll just get like an A3 pad, and every kind of 2-hour reading block, which was generally what I did my reading in because that's kind of what I figured I could concentrate, I would just start in the middle, write like the name of the paper or like the name of the authors that I was starting with. And then as I explored a link, I would draw a line from that and I'd write on the line why I was exploring the link, and then I'd draw another circle and where I went to. And that just gave me a visual picture of like what I was actually doing in this vastly confusing kind of research space, trying to get my head around these complex theories. And I found that I got lost much less because I wasn't trying to hold in working memory like the whole navigational path of my reading for that day or that 2-hour block. It was extremely helpful. So that's one thing we can do. And the other thing is just making sure more information is in long-term memory, as we were referring to, because again, it's only the new information that's going to be confusing to you or cognitively overloading. So the more you know, the less confused you will get in any particular domain.
Yeah. We had a good example when we were trying to book this podcast of when I think probably fair to say I got cognitively overloaded trying to figure out time zones between us. And for me, that's an example where I guess there's sort of multiple elements of my time zone, your time zone, the difference, whether that's in there. But it's not just about the numbers. It's also like, is that a reasonable time for you? Is that a good time for me? Like perhaps part of me is also, maybe this is sort of more extraneous load stuff, but like I'm ruminating on, my excitement for the conversation and, we're looking forward to it and hoping we can make times work. And, so there's all that stuff. And, confession to listeners, I messed up the time we were supposed to be doing this, and fortunately, we managed to figure it out. But for me, that's always been it's always been a good example that I get confused in over the years. And normally I use a version of that getting it out of your head strategy, and I just plug it into a little online tool. For whatever reason, even when using that tool to fix this, it still didn't quite click for me. But like certainly using that strategy of, okay, I don't need to do the maths in my head, I can use this little tool to do the maths. That takes my error rate down from, I don't know, probably 10, 20% to 0.5%.
Definitely. It's a great strategy, just getting it out of your head.
So I think we've probably got at least 3 strategies so far based on all the things we've been talking about. If we are in that situation where we're feeling a little bit lost by material, or we're looking at a problem and we can't quite get our heads around it, can't quite solve what's going on, that's that first one of just thinking about your extraneous load. Is there other stuff that's distracting you? Is your phone on? Are you listening to distracting music? Are you daydreaming about something? Okay, what strategies can we use to remove or dial down those distractions? So that might be the first thing to ask yourself. We had the idea of, I sometimes call it pre-learning material. So if there are concepts, vocabulary, terminology, even if they're not totally unfamiliar, if your fluency, your automaticity, as you put it, if you're sort of if it's a struggle for you to bring those ideas to memory, and yes, you can do it, but it takes a lot of mental effort to remember it, then it's going to be very difficult to use that idea and build on it when you're reading something new or learning a new lecture. So maybe just taking some of those ideas out of context and actually learning them as you were describing.
Definitely. Or even just moving from like knowing nothing to being a bit familiar with the words. Like if you're like, it's a spectrum. If you hear 5 new words in a lecture, like you're probably in trouble. If you hear 3 words that you've heard before, so they kind of sound a bit familiar, and you're like, oh, I've heard something about that, but I don't remember, that is actually going to reduce your cognitive load as well. So like I would say to listeners, like, don't be afraid of, if you've only got 5 minutes to kind of do some pre-reading, actually do use those 5 minutes. You know, maybe use them on ChatGPT or something to type in 3 words and be like, give me 1 sentence summary of each of these words. That will actually help you to manage as well. But as you've said, like if you concretely taking the time to expertly learn and chunk and automate that information, that's going to be even better as well.
That's great advice. Definitely. Thank you. So that was the second one. And that third one you were just talking about just now, where, you know, if there are ways to get processes out of your head, if you can write things down, if, you know, I use that example of using a tool, maybe for someone else it would be using a calculator. You know, if you could do mental maths, and there's mental maths involved in solving a certain problem, but the kind of mechanics of finding your way through that problem are otherwise quite challenging, then, you know, remove that bit of processing from your brain. Just let a calculator handle the mental maths, you and then free up as much of your kind of working memory capacity as possible to really kind of engage with, you know, what's going on in the algebra or whatever it is that's complex, that you're finding complex.
Definitely. I mean, I couldn't agree more on that. One caveat is for students to think about is, do they need to have the ability to do that arithmetic mentally in their exam scenario? Because in that case, then they want to really drill and potentially like off to the side and as a separate task, they want to chunk and automate that mathematics so that when they're in the exam scenario, they have complete fluency with that. But if they're in a subject where they can use a calculator or a scientific calculator in the exam or a graphics calculator, then yes, 100% lean on that calculator as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So it's just 3 good examples to reduce the distractions, get stuff out of your head, write it down, and pre-learn details. Are there any other good ideas you'd be particularly keen to share?
Yeah, I'll give you 3. Listeners may or may not remember the definition of cognitive load theory from earlier, which was cognitive load theory is a collection of instructional recommendations based upon the science of how humans learn. And so that first part, I will give you 3 of the instructional recommendations now. One relates to the redundancy effect. One is termed the split attention effect, and one is termed the worked example effect. So redundancy effect is basically the idea of we need to remove redundant information because redundant information is a source of extraneous load. It's a source of distractions, it's a source of filling up our working memory with things that we don't want to. For learners, one big source of redundancy is when you are trying to read something that's on a slide and the lecturer is reading that information out at the same time. Now, this is because your working memory has a number of kind of channels that information can enter it via. One of those channels is auditory and one of them is visual. But what happens if we try to listen to, assuming you can read, if we try to listen to words at the same time as reading those words, we actually end up with kind of interference with those 2 channels. And so I'm sure that if listeners like think back to sitting in a lecture, they might notice that if they're trying to read the text at the same time as listening to the lecturer read the text as well, they're kind of skimming over one of them, and it's kind of like you're not really following as closely as you can. And that's because these 2 channels are kind of in conflict at that particular time. And so the advice to lecturers is like, don't read out your slides, basically. But the advice to students is, well, step 1, tell your lecturers not to read out the slides. But 2, if you're not confident enough to do that, or if they don't listen, choose for yourself whether you're going to listen or whether you're going to read. And that's based upon your preference. So you might want to stop listening, maybe put some headphones in or some earplugs, as, you know, assuming you have long hair or a hijab on. So hopefully the lecturer can't see that. But put something in your ears and read, or your fingers whilst they're reading, and read it for yourself. Or, and this is my favorite, just don't look at the text and just watch the actual lecturer themselves and listen to what they're saying and jot down what you're noting. That's my favorite because often the lecturer actually emphasizes the most important points more effectively than they are emphasized in the writing. And so if you do find yourself in a classroom where lecturer is reading from the slides, my recommendation would be just look at the lecturer. You'll find it more engaging and you'll probably get the kind of tidbits and the insights more effectively. So that was a redundancy effect. Second one's the split attention effect. And I did refer to this before, but a summary of this is information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. Information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. Let me give you an example of this. You might find it confusing if you're looking at a diagram. An example I often show is a diagram of the heart, and the different parts of the heart may be labeled, but maybe they're labeled with like an A and a B and a C and a D. And then separately to that, there's a list that says A, B, C, D, and then the different parts of the heart. Now, your attention is split between the list and the diagram. And if you want to go, oh, A, what is that? You're looking at the diagram, then you need to go across the list. A, what is that? Oh, it's the aorta. Sure. So you need to integrate that. That's tricky. Another example is, and I'm sure people have found this where they're kind of reading, if they've read an academic paper, there might be a figure on one page and then the description of the figure on another page. And so they need to kind of flip back and forth or scroll up and down, depending hard copy or computer. And you have to kind of hold in your memory what the figure looks like while you then go to the description and try to interpret the description, try to hold the description in working memory, and then go back to the image. And like that's incredibly cognitively demanding task to like hold one thing in memory whilst trying to integrate it with another. That's called split attention, essentially. So what we can do to get around this, there's two basic strategies. One is like if it's in a hard copy book, take a photo of the image, put your phone next to the textbook and just turn the page so that you can look at the image at the same time as reading it. If you're on your computer, take a screenshot of it. Or if you're in Microsoft Word or something like that, there's actually, if you just go view and then split, there's actually a split screen option. So you can scroll the top and bottom half of the page independently and you can make sure you can see the diagram at the same time as the text. This is also really helpful if you're trying to like see the references. Often if I'm reading a paper, I actually use a PDF reader on Mac called Skim, S-K-I-M, which also allows you to split the screen. Or if you can't split the screen, you can duplicate the PDF and kind of open two copies of it side by side. And I'll often have the references up on one document and the main text up on the other document, so I don't lose all this time scrolling between. Another example of that is if you're kind of doing questions in the textbook and the answers are at the back. I often see students like, I'm going to scroll 100 pages to the answers, check the answers and scroll 100 pages back up to like the questions again, then scroll back down. It's like just duplicate the PDF, call one answers, call one text, and have them open so you can just tab between them or left and right on the screen or on your separate screen, something like that. So that's the split attention effect. And the final one I want to mention is the worked example effect. And this is basically the idea that novices in any domain find it most effective to learn a procedure or process most quickly if they have a concrete example of what success looks like. A pretty classic example of this is kind of maths or physics or chemistry, something like that. It's like, how do you solve this type of question? Here's an example. Let's look at this example. Let's try to work out what's going on in it, and let's apply it to a similar question. So for instructors, like make sure you include worked examples for your novice students or novices in a specific domain. And for students, like seek out worked examples because worked examples are going to help you know exactly how to do that problem. For more complex tasks, sometimes it's hard to get worked examples. An example is writing my thesis, my master's thesis. I didn't know what my master's thesis was meant to look like. So what I actually did was I messaged my supervisor and I said, I'm super confused by this. Can you please send me the best thesis that you have received in the last 10 years as an example? And he was happy to share that. And then what I didn't just read that, I actually deconstructed that thesis. I read the first paragraph and I didn't say like, what's he saying? What's the author saying in this paragraph? I said, what is the author actually doing in this paragraph? And it was something like arguing for the relevance of this theory, talking about how this research relates to that relevance and talking about what this research is going to say that's new, right? So you can actually deconstruct from an example to kind of level of principles, and that can be really, really helpful as well. And then in terms of getting the most out of an example like that, a really effective thing to do, and I guess I'm moving into kind of a fourth recommendation here, but this is the idea of self-explanation. The idea of self-explanation is basically doing what I was just modeling then. It's like going beyond the surface features of the example. The surface features are what you can see and what's immediately apparent. You know, in maths, it might be like, and then from line 2 to line 3, they divided by 2. In a text, that might be, first they introduce they said there's 253 participants of average age 13.4 years, whatever it might be. Going beyond that to try to find the deeper structure of it. And a good way to do that is through self-explanation. And self-explanation basically just means asking yourselves questions about the content and then answer them to try to build deeper understanding, what you would call like helping to make it click, I guess, William. And so 3 really good example questions that you can ask yourself, and works in a variety of contexts and learning environments. It's really helpful to ask yourself, 1, how are blank and blank similar? So if you're learning something new, think about that new thing and think about it in relation to something you've learned before, and think, how is this new thing similar from that thing I learned before? You can probably guess the next one. It's what is the difference between blank and blank? So I've just learned something new. How is that actually different from this concept I've learned before? That's going to help you distinguish between them. And then similarly, how does blank tie in with what I've learned before? So what are the connections? Apart from similarities and differences, are there any kind of additional connections that I should be aware of? Now, that's 3 out of many self-explanation question examples. There's lots in lots of places, including in my book on cognitive load theory. But those 3 come from a paper by Alison King in 1994. But they are 3 excellent things that people can ask themselves to try to build deeper understanding based upon examples that they see.
And I think one of the interesting things about that last one in particular for me is just hearing you describe that. I'm just putting myself in my own shoes as a learner and how I'd react to that advice. And I think probably my reaction would be, gosh, that sounds like hard work. But that's the thing about effective learning. It so often is hard work. And we talk about that a lot in the context of retrieval practice. And it does feel more effortful than just sitting there and reading something or making notes. But it is engaging brain and putting in that little bit of effort that leads to much deeper understanding, much more durable learning, all those things we're trying to achieve.
Definitely.
So self-explanation, really kind of looking at those worked examples, using that split attention effect. So integrating information in space and time where you can. Another example that popped into my head while you were talking about that was when I took high school science exams, there was often a formula sheet printed in the front of the exam paper. I think in hindsight, the trick there would have been to actually like rip that page out, or maybe even just super quick, like scribble it out on a piece of rough paper and then have it to one hand side. You're nodding very emphatically for listeners' benefits.
Yeah, I've explicitly taught my students to do that because that is a way to reduce split attention. So we'll recognise there, William. That's great.
Yeah. And then for that first one, you were talking about the redundancy effect and trying to, that was some really good sort of practical advice there about sort of when lecturers are both reading text from the slide, and the reading text from the slide that you could also read with your eyes, just focusing on one of those things. Ollie, thank you so much for everything we talked about today. It's such an interesting look at the theory and so many great practical takeaways. I've really, really enjoyed exploring this with you, and thank you for being so generous with your wisdom and passion on this subject. It's been so interesting. So again, thank you. Just as we kind of bring this thing to a close, I just wanted to ask quickly about your PhD. Sounds like a really interesting topic. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Yeah, so I'm looking at self-regulated learning. Essentially, that means like what can we do to help students become more effective learners? And this stemmed from my experience as a teacher and basically recognizing that the difference between the students who get high marks and the students who get low marks relates to how they approach their study, both from like an affective or an attitudinal way and from a more cognitive way as well in terms of learning strategies. And so I was asking myself, like, what can I do as a teacher to help the less effective students move more towards being more effective students? And so we've actually run a number of experiments, but I mean, one example, and that some of it include flashcards, some of it include, checking your answers more thoroughly, so on. The one that I've been doing most recently and thinking about therefore most recently is actually about helping students to learn from worked examples. And so we basically came up with a flow diagram that we called the Maths Mastery Method, to help students think to themselves, if I get stuck on a question in mathematics, this was year 8 students, if I get stuck on a question in mathematics, what can I do? And so we explicitly taught them how to find a worked example that relates to the question that they're stuck on. We explicitly taught them how to read it and how to ask themselves questions about it. We explicitly told them to then cover up the answer in the worked example and try to redo the worked example. And then we explicitly taught them to then do a number of questions that relate to it and to check their answers. Now, it might sound extremely simple. And for people who are already effective learners, that's kind of like, well, yeah, that's what you do, obviously. But for a lot of students, they don't actually know to do that, and they don't know how to do that. And even if they do look at a worked example, they don't actually process it at a level of depth that enables them to generalize from that example to other similar questions. So yeah, we did that, and that experiment had really encouraging results. Students got both better at learning from worked examples, and they saw increases in their examination results in a number of tests later. So that was really encouraging. And also as part of that experiment, we looked at some of the affective things, like what do you have to do as an instructor to encourage students to make the changes that they need to make? And we did some experimental manipulations there too. So that's a bit of a quick summary of some of my PhD work so far.
Absolutely fascinating. No, that's fascinating. You mentioned you've obviously got a lifelong interest in this area of sort of being effective. You mentioned you'd had an interest yourself as a learner, and obviously now as a researcher as well as instructor. I wondered, is the kind of one piece of advice you particularly wish you'd known back when you were a younger learner yourself?
I guess one of the things that there's probably two things. One is that I think there's sometimes a trap that we can fall into, which is thinking that like all learnings can be solved through brute force spaced repetition, right? Just like if I expose myself to this content enough and frequently enough and on the optimum schedule, like I'm going to learn it and it's going to stick. And I've learned that like that is not the case. You need to do significant work as well to make meaningful connections between the new information, the old connection, and the old information, should I say, the new information, the old information, in order for it to actually stick. And the more hard work you do at the outset to make those meaningful connections, the less spaced repetition you'll need to do later to help it to actually stay in long-term memory. So that's the first thing. It's like more of a practical thing. And the second thing from more of a theoretical kind of standpoint is I have come to think about learning and knowledge as kind of expanding an empire, right? So imagine the Roman Empire or something like that, expanding, and you're trying to like conquer new knowledge domains. The thing is, you actually need to do work to defend the domains that you are trying to conquer, right? And so if I head off in the north direction, and we might call north like mathematics or something, I don't know. If I head off in that direction, if I then start to focus too much on another direction and don't like continue to either defend my northern territory or like move beyond and go deeper and deeper, that northern territory is going to be attacked by like the natural decay of memory, essentially, and I will lose a lot of the ground that I've made. And so as a learner, I've come to realize that like I can actually only focus my area on a number of fronts at any one time. And if I spread myself too thin without sending enough reinforcements, i.e. time and effort in different directions, like I'll actually find it's like I'm really struggling in lots of different areas to maintain that knowledge. The most powerful learning happens when you actually pick a direction to head in and you keep on heading in that direction. Because, you know, if we think about that kind of expanding empire analogy, if you go 3 territories to the north, even if you leave it for a while, some decay is going to happen, but you're still going to be like at the second territory after a couple of years or something like that. Mm-hmm. So think about the depth of not learning that you're going to. Think about how thin you're spreading yourself, and just keep in mind that if you do spend a lot of time in one area but then kind of neglect that area for an extended period of time, you might come back and find that you know your cities have been burnt and your livestock have been killed and so on, and there's nothing but death and decay, and that might be depressing, but that's actually just a natural part of what happens during learning, and that's something we need to think about strategically when we're thinking about how we're trying to expand our knowledge domain, especially for people like me who have a poorer long-term memories.
That's fascinating. It's great insights. I think the interesting thing about the if your lands have been ransacked, if you'd built them in the first place, I tend to think they get rebuilt much more quickly than the first time. So all is not lost. We can rebuild, fields can be resown, and it's generally a lot faster next time round.
Yeah, definitely.
Outstanding. This has been fascinating, Ollie. Thank you so much once again. Where should we go to learn more if we're interested in this topic and your work generally?
Sure. Well, if people are just really interested in cognitive load theory, my book, Cognitive Load Theory in Action, I think people will find particularly interesting. I've had students write to me and say that it's interesting. I've had many hundreds of teachers write to me. And I've even had parents, one or a number of parents have emailed me. I can remember one in particular. A person said, my child has learning difficulties and reading your book has helped me understand how their mind works in more detail. And that's helped me to support their learning much better, which was really encouraging to me. So yeah, if people are interested in cognitive load theory specifically, they could check that out.
You do have some explicit sections in the book that, it is advice for learners. So I'm not surprised you're getting that positive feedback. It's a really nice blend of the theory and advice for teachers and advice for learners themselves, which you don't always see in books on educational theory. And I really enjoyed that, for certainly.
Thanks, William. If people want to go deeper, I do have an online course on cognitive load theory, which is like super in-depth, and it's going to, as far as I'm aware, it's basically the most in-depth thing you can engage with in cognitive load theory online. So people might be interested in that. I also write like a semi-weekly. I try to make a weekly, but I don't always get their email. So if people are keen to sign up to EdThreads, that is a pretty broad email. It's basically about thinking, learning, knowledge, wisdom, things like that. So if people are keen for a bit of interesting content each week or almost each week, EdThreads they might find particularly interesting. And then, I've got my own podcast as well, the Education Research Reading Room, which often caters to teachers, often caters to students. We've had multiple episodes specifically on like how to learn more effectively and things like that. So listeners might be interested in that as well.
Outstanding. Well, we'll link all those in the show notes. And I was enjoying taking a look at your course this morning. It's a very high quality, very nicely put together. And you've built in some sort of nice retrieval practice quizzes all the way through to consolidate what you're learning. It's, highly recommended for a deep dive on this subject. So, Ollie, thank you so much once again. Really enjoyed this. And we'll talk again soon, hopefully.
Thanks, William. I've really enjoyed it too. And keep up the fantastic work supporting all the students. You're doing a great job.
Well, thanks for that fascinating conversation, Ollie. Do check out the episode description for all the relevant links to Ollie's resources, including the link to purchase Ollie's excellent course, Cognitive Load Theory Mastery, which I've taken myself and would highly recommend, especially if you are an educator wanting to master this really important idea. The Exam Study Expert podcast will earn a small commission if you purchase through our referral link. That's at no cost to you, of course. So you'll be supporting the show and the work we do, in addition to getting your hands on a fantastic bit of training. Again, see the episode description for that link, or you can visit examstudyexpert.com/CLT for cognitive load theory, and you'll be redirected. examstudyexpert.com/CLT. And if I may just finish with a little plug for one of my own resources. It's been a very long time since I mentioned Outsmart Your Exams on the show, my very first ever book that I wrote all those years back. But with exam season looming for many students as I record this seems like a very relevant time to mention a book all about how to outsmart an exam through cunning test-taking techniques. Outsmart Your Exams is a pretty unique collection of practical tips and tricks you can use in the exam itself to gain additional marks. The promise is that simple. And quite a few of the strategies therein have their theoretical basis in cognitive load theory, with a couple of them even snuck their way into this episode today, if you were listening closely. I'll pop a link for that book in the show notes too. I'm even happy to throw in a complimentary copy of the book, Outsmart Your Exams, because it does tie in so well to cognitive load theory, as a bonus for anyone who is going to pick up Ollie's Cognitive Load Theory Mastery course via our referral code. Just follow the link in the show notes to pick up Ollie's course through the referral code. And then if you forward your receipt for that course to me, William at examstudyexperts.com, I'll send you a copy of Outsmart Your Exams right out, your choice of digital edition or paperback. And if you yourself are looking at exams looming over the next few weeks, or perhaps you've already started, then I want to wish you every success. Very best of luck. You've got this. Thank you so much for listening today, and I will look forward to seeing you again soon.
If you've got exams coming up, you can now get all of William's favourite tips and tricks to save you time and get you higher grades, all in one handy cheat sheet. Grab your copy at examstudyexpert.com/free tips. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.